April 1865. The war that had torn the United States apart for 4 years was finally ending. The roads of Virginia were thick with mud and exhausted soldiers. Wagons creaked past fields stripped bare by campaigning armies, and the once proud Army of Northern Virginia was down to little more than starving men and worn rifles. In a small Virginia town called Appomattox Courthouse, one of the most famous generals in American history sat inside a quiet parlor and prepared to surrender. That man was Robert E. Lee. Within hours, Lee would meet with Ulysses S. Grant and effectively bring the largest Confederate army to an end. The war would soon be over. But the argument about Robert E. Lee was only beginning. For more than 150 years, Lee has been remembered in radically different ways. Most notably, he has been slandered, abused, and maligned. But when you look closely at the historical record, it simply doesn't match the things that we are told about him. Today, we're going to look at 3 ways people are wrong about Robert E. Lee. Alright guys, I'm your host, The Civic Mandate, on my show, The Civic Mandate. Hope you guys enjoy this episode. We're going to be talking about Robert E. Lee, and we're going to be shedding some light on some of the controversy surrounding him and his name. Hope you guys enjoy it. The first aspect of this that we are going to look at is ideology. Was Lee an ideological secessionist? Was he aligned completely with the Confederacy's ideals of removing themselves from the Union? Now, I think this topic is a lot more complicated than a lot of people want to make it out to be, because there are many quotes of Lee, and I'll include a couple in this section, of him completely opposing secession. But then you might ask, why did he join the Confederacy? And we'll get into that later in this episode. But to give a couple quotes from Lee here, he called secession a revolution. He opposed it in principle. He described the conflict as something he wished to avoid entirely. He didn't think that 2 halves of the United States should be fighting each other. I mean, really, what we're talking about here is a man who served over 30 years in the United States Army before the war. Obviously, he fought in the Mexican-American War with many of the people he would then fight against in the Civil War too, which is ironic and tragic in a way. And he certainly held loyalty to the Union, to the United States, and he wasn't ideologically opposed in any way to the United States. In 1861, many Americans did not see the Union as we might see it today. They saw it as a federation or a voluntary compact of sovereign states. And of course, that is part of what the Civil War was about, is to settle this issue of states' rights. What authority do the states have compared to the central authority of the federal government? Where is the line drawn? Issues like this were part of why the Civil War even happened. So it is not weird for us to see a man like Lee have a extreme loyalty for the Union, but a greater loyalty to his state of Virginia. Because what you see is his decision was initially only to Virginia. He wasn't going to go with the South. In fact, he probably would have accepted the North's offer of leading their armies until Virginia seceded. This kind of shows off the state loyalties that existed that are virtually non-existent today, especially in the western states, but perhaps they are more prevalent in some of the eastern and southern states. So while you may disagree with the decision that he made, the decision to join the South and join his state and leave the Union, you cannot call him a fanatic secessionist by any means. He was more of a pragmatic secessionist. Or rather, he was forced into a scenario where he had to make the choice, which, in my opinion, really only contributes to the tragic story of General E. Lee in the Civil War. This next point we're going to be looking at is slavery. Now, this is, I think, the weakest argument against Lee that exists, calling slavery a motivating factor of Lee's leadership. Now, it is good to kind of put out there that he did have slaves. He inherited slaves through his family, but he also called slavery a moral and political evil. His loyalty was tied to Virginia and family, like we talked about, not to slavery. He wasn't in the war to prevent slavery. He disliked slavery. He called it an evil. What he favored, which is in my opinion the most pragmatic approach to the issue of slavery, was a reasonable, gradual emancipation and something that wouldn't destroy the South completely. Obviously, the South's economy was completely propped up on slavery, whereas the North was industrialized. And as we've seen throughout history, societies that are slavery-based cannot industrialize till they get rid of slavery. So he did favor a gradual emancipation so that they wouldn't completely destroy what the South's economy was built on. He saw the dangers of sudden abolition being social collapse, obviously, because you have a social caste that's been made, an unjust one, of course, but the caste has been made, and to break that causes a lot of chaos. And of course, the economic devastation would be insane, similar to what we saw in the Reconstruction era. Now, although the Articles of Secession did mention slavery multiple times as part of the reason for secession, part of the reason the war continuing, all this sort of stuff, Lee did not by any means shape Confederate slavery policy or any political policy, really. All he was a general fighting on the battlefield to protect his homeland. And he did quite a good job at it, at that. Now, this last topic we're going to look at is this idea of Lee being a traitor to the United States. Now, I'm going to admit, I told people about this script a little while ago. The thumbnail was a little controversial when I announced it. This is probably one of the hardest ones to pull off, and I don't think Lee was a traitor. I'm going to get it out of the way. I don't think he was a traitor. I know you're already in the comments telling me how Lee was a traitor, but let's get into it. Let's hear some of my points. For an American of the 19th century, Lee held an immense amount of loyalty. His loyalty was primarily to the Federalist system, specifically his state of Virginia, which he held deep ties to. Obviously, it was his birthplace. Lee loved the system that he served under for 30 years, and he appreciated the values of the American Constitution. Before he made his decision, he spent nights agonizing over it, going back and forth, talking about whether or not he should resign his commission with the Union. He held genuine regret for the decision he had to make. The fact is, Lee still held loyalty to the Union, even after the war was over. Even if he had won the war, he said multiple times he would have argued for a Union again. All he wanted to do was protect his lands. He had no choice over whether Virginia decided to enter the war or not, but all he knew is that he was going to protect his family. He would not raise a hand against the people that had raised him. After Appomattox, he urged the Southerners to accept the results. He could have kept fighting a guerrilla war if he really wanted to, but he didn't. He had been beaten, fair and square, and he was ready to go home. He was ready for the Union to come back. Once a war was done, Lee supported Reconstruction and disapproved of any attempts to continue the fight. To quote him himself, he said, "The war being at an end, I believe it to be the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country and the establishment of peace and harmony." Lee was not a traitor. He was indicted for treason, but was never brought to court. He was also never pardoned. If the U.S. leaders in the day did not believe that he had committed treason, then why should we? He was never punished for it, because they understood the decision he had to make. If the contemporaries who fought against him in a war that tore the country apart did not pursue execution or even trial, then perhaps our modern certainty that we have now deserves some scrutiny. Lee was not a traitor. Maybe you could say that he was a traitor during the war, but after the war and before the war, he certainly wasn't. Calling someone a traitor is a very, very serious statement to make. It's something that the person has to fully believe with their heart, and Lee just simply didn't. Lee was in a tough situation, and he made the decision. I believe he made the right decision to defend his family over fighting for the Union. But it was a tough situation. One can't help but feel sorrow at the situation he was in. With that said, I know it's a bit of a shorter episode today, but I hope that this can somehow convince you guys that perhaps there's more to Lee than we've always been told. Perhaps we need to relook at his character, the person he was. I'm going to do my outro now because we have a cold outro, or I guess a hot outro, right after this. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you have a great day. Remember to like and subscribe on the channel. Share it with your friends. Comment down below. Tell me how I'm wrong. It really helps. Hope you guys enjoy this hot close we have for you. Hope you have a great day, and God bless. In October of 1870, 5 years after the guns fell silent at Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee lay dying in Lexington, Virginia. The war that had defined his life and the nation was over. The Confederacy he had fought for was gone, and the country he had once served for more than 3 decades was slowly trying to piece itself back together. Lee had spent those final years urging reconciliation, telling former Confederates to lay down their bitterness and to accept the results of the war and restore the Union. But as the end approached, his mind drifted back to the place that had defined him most, the Army. Those who stood beside his bed recorded that his final words were simple: strike the tents. A soldier's words, not the language of ideology or politics or grand speeches, just the quiet command of a man whose campaign was finally over. For more than 150 years, people have argued about the legacy of Robert E. Lee, whether he should be remembered as a hero, a villain, or something in between. Lee was a man of his time. He was shaped by loyalties, conflicts, and decisions that still echo through the American history today. If we want to understand the past honestly, it's time we recognize Lee as a tragic figure that he was. He was complex, he was human, and we can't just blindly label him a villain. He was caught between the forces of history and the choices of others. And with that final order, Robert E. Lee struck the tents.